Hello there. Really nice to be with you all. Welcome to this session in our UNA UK Members Conference. I'm UNA UK Chair, Stuart Wood, and I'm really delighted to be with you, albeit virtually, tonight. I just want to say a couple of words before introducing our first speaker and our keynote address. The paradox of our moment is that the challenges that we all face, from COVID to climate change to migration, to economic revival, are pointing in the direction of greater cooperation. The politics, not so much, as we all know. But I really want to start this evening with a tone of optimism about this. Firstly, underneath the turn to nationalism and populism that we've all seen, international cooperation and collaboration remains a source of huge hope. We take the story of the now famous story of the Pfizer vaccine, invented by children of Turkish gastarbeiter who migrated to Germany. Think about the climate change social movement we've seen develop in the last 2, 3, 4 years. Think of the continuing quietly transformative work of the UN and development agencies in areas like Yemen and more recently in Tigray in Africa. That's a cause for hope. Also, the biggest challenges we face, and to which, crucially, citizens will hold their governments to account, cannot be resolved without the international cooperation that we all value so much. COVID, of course, is going to demand new forms of cooperation in research, in aid, in pandemic control across borders, as is economic revival, as is migration, as is terrorism, as are a myriad of other challenges that we all are so concerned about. And I also have to mention, of course, the hope that Donald Trump's hopeful exit from the White House will give us all in the next few months as well. Because whatever your political affiliation, that gives us, I think, a chance at a fresh start for a bit of American leadership on some of these agendas. So how can we help rebuild? I mean, I strongly believe we shouldn't just be asserting international cooperation as a virtuous thing and just expecting everyone to agree with us. Those of us who believe in it have a duty to demonstrate that international cooperation and investing in international regimes and international organizations actually works better in solving the problems that voters and citizens care about. What does that mean? It means building habits of cooperation, step by step. It means carrying the debate to the people where we live and nationally and internationally on challenging conceptions of self-interest, widening that notion of what self-interest is. It means investing in international institutions, multilateral regimes, thinking about new areas for international cooperation where the institutions may be relatively silent, in health and pandemics, for example, maybe in climate as well. It means democratizing the idea of international cooperation. You know, international cooperation can't just be about summits between leaders. It has to go deeper, and I'm really proud that UNA UK has led the Together First Coalition. It has led the debate about how that might be democratized more. And holding governments' feet to the fire in working together across boundaries. That seems to me something that we can all do wherever we live. So we're going to explore these themes and the broader challenge of how to revive and reanimate internationalism with 2 interactive sessions and discussions this evening. Later, we're going to be joined by James Bell from the Pew Research Center for a presentation discussion on the degree to which the general publics of different countries support international cooperation and compromise. But first, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce an old friend. Natalie Sriskandarajah, the CEO of Oxfam GB, is going to give us a keynote lecture. Now, I've known Danny for years. I knew him years ago. It makes me feel very old to think about it. When he was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, when he was always the most optimistic and energetic person in any room he was in. Danny was born in Sri Lanka in the 70s, was initially raised in a rural community without electricity or running water. His family was displaced by the onset of civil war, and he spent time in Papua New Guinea and Australia, where he went to school and university. In 98, Danny moved to the UK, completed his master's and doctorate in international development at Oxford University, and became a British citizen in 2010. Before joining Oxfam GB as chief executive in January of last year, he led CIVICUS, the Johannesburg-based alliance of civil society organizations with members in more than 180 countries. And prior to that, he spent 4 years as Director General of the Royal Commonwealth Society, where he became not only the youngest, but also the first non-British born head of that 140-year-old organization. Danny's written many reports, many academic articles on international migration and economic development, and you'll read and see him regularly on a range of topics on the media. He's also involved in several boards, including those of the Bering Foundation, International Alert, and Ockenden International. So Danny, we're absolutely delighted that you spared the time, and we're looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, Lord Wood, and hello everyone. I hope you're all safe and well as we navigate these strange and uncertain times. But I wish we could meet in person in some fabulous room in London or somewhere else. But here we are, and thank you to the UNA for this opportunity to speak together. Stuart, you said about optimism, and I'm going to try to keep that theme going as best as I can, because despite all that's going on around us, I do think this is a moment where those of us who are internationalists, those of us who are progressive internationalists, need to focus on the opportunity here. And I'm going to try to spend my 20 minutes or so just talking through a few areas where I do see that there are opportunities. One, around the opportunities for meaningful international cooperation on agendas that may not seem so obvious, but where I do think international institutions, particularly the United Nations, can play a really important role. Secondly, and I suppose this is a precursor to the research that Pew is going to be talking about, and something I know Natalie Sammersinger has been working on, to look at what all of this might mean for civic participation, for the role of each of us as citizens in global governance, in that international architecture, and just sort of flagging what I see as some opportunities to do something innovative, something creative about the nature of citizen voice in global governance. And finally, just to spend a few minutes on the role of Britain in all of this. It feels, like on all of the other agendas, that we are facing some headwinds, but I remain really optimistic that Britain can play an important, positive, progressive role on the world stage once again. And I think that once again point is really important to recognize. Oxfam, as I hope some of you will know, has been around for just a little bit longer than the United Nations. We were founded in 1942, but with similar values and a similar origin story, I suppose, as the United Nations, and therefore the United Nations Association. And I think it was in that previous moment of dark human history, of war, of strife, that I think people came together. In our case, 8 volunteers in a basement of the university church in Oxford, with this vision, with this commitment to this vision that international solidarity matters, that it's really important that each of us thinks not just about ourselves and our own communities, but about the wider world. And in the case of Oxfam, those 8 people set about doing 2 really important things that have been at the heart of Oxfam's journey for the last 78 years. First was to do something about famine or poverty, in the first case of people who were dying of hunger behind Nazi lines in occupied Europe. But the second thing was to speak truth to power, to say that if we are civilized human beings, then we need to have a humanitarian approach to issues of hunger, of poverty, of extreme vulnerability. And Oxfam and organizations like us have been standing up for people all across the world, particularly for marginalized and vulnerable groups, for all of these years. And I think behind each of those commitments, whether it's taking action to relieve poverty or speaking truth to power, lies this commitment to international solidarity, to a progressive internationalism. And if ever there was a moment to rechannel that commitment, it feels like today. you don't need me to tell you about all that's going on around us as we try to deal with not just the coronavirus pandemic, but a number of other crises that beset the world. When in terms of development, we are seeing what we fear is the great reversal. Decades of hard-won progress on international development are being reversed before our eyes. 500 million people, we think, will face poverty as a result of coronavirus disruptions to their lives, to their economies, to their livelihoods. And we think more people will die as a result of hunger caused by COVID disruption than from the disease itself. And if you wanted or for me, a really important reminder of that was a text message a colleague of mine received very early on in the pandemic from a taxi driver who drives him when he visits Nairobi. And this taxi driver said back in March, he texted my colleague and said, "This virus is going to starve us before it infects us." And so for all of us who are interested in poverty, in hunger, in famine, this has been a really difficult period. But of course, it's not just in that sphere that we are seeing challenge to all those values that I think internationalists believe in. We are seeing democracy in decline. We've seen a rise in authoritarianism, of nationalism, of populism. We've seen civic space, the conditions for each of us to organize and mobilize, constrict in far too many parts of the world. And of course, I don't need to tell you about the climate crisis that we are facing. This year already has become the hottest year on record. The clock is ticking on a climate emergency that we need urgent and ambitious action on. And finally, just as I mentioned earlier, here in Britain, it feels like it's a moment of retreat where there is a risk, especially with all the uncertainties of what Brexit might mean for this country, that this country that was built, at least in recent decades, on this notion of international solidarity, retreats into nationalism, retreats into a mercantilism where we put trade or a mercantilist interest over above everything else. Or, as someone who worked for the Commonwealth, I'm very familiar with, a sort of a risk that we fall into a trap of neo-imperialism, that we try to reinvent or create Empire 2.0. And so there's no shortage of risks out there to those values that I think we all share and value really importantly. But I do think that this is a once in a generation opportunity to reset, to rethink, to reimagine, and to stand up for those notions of international solidarity. And it feels particularly timely, just as the United Nations itself turns 75, for us to think about what those next few years and decades for not just the UN, but for the global architecture might look like. So let me just cover a few of the areas where that internationalism, that international cooperation is going to be incredibly important, and where we need international cooperation to work well, but perhaps where we need to think of different ways of approaching those global challenges, where the sort of challenges of the 21st century may well need a new architecture when it comes to global governance, a new vision, a new framework for global cooperation. And I know some people, particularly folk like Natalie, have been thinking about how the UN might play its role in addressing some of those challenges. Let's start with an obvious place, which is the coronavirus pandemic, and how we might need, how international cooperation might help us see this through. I think there have been, it's important to recognize there have been some really important initiatives that have helped us pull together for common good, to protect global public interests in this pandemic response. We should recognize that aid donors have pulled together to support Humanitarian Response, $17 billion so far. The WHO itself is creating a patent pool to share vaccines technology. G20 finance ministers are working together to agree a temporary suspension of debt repayments for some developing countries so that they can prioritize helping their citizens through this. But I think this is an opportunity for us to go further and perhaps go differently. You know, if this really is a pandemic that reminds us of how deeply interconnected we have become as humans, and that no one is safe until everyone is safe, then I hope this is an opportunity for us to think through what more we might do to protect our common humanity, to protect those people who are most vulnerable from global shocks like this. And, you know, we've been working with partners on something called the Campaign for a People's Vaccine, because we and others think that this is exactly the moment in human history when we need to put aside some of the sort of rule book and the dogma, if you will, when it comes to things like intellectual property. And we need to have a meaningful pooling of technologies, of patents, of intellectual property that will allow us to come together and scale up, not just the vaccines, but the treatments, and not just the vaccines for COVID-19, but for treatments for global health challenges that we continue to face. And I think there is a real opportunity here. Stuart, you talked about the vaccine, and if we should recognize that we are stepping in the right direction. For example, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, we believe that the Oxford University researchers are working with AstraZeneca to make sure that the production of that particular vaccine will be done at no profit for the company in the developing world and for the entire world, for at least for the first half of 2021. A step in that direction of thinking about how we really make this a global public good and we protect global interests, and that we don't retreat into a form of vaccine nationalism. And it's great to see the WHO play a leadership role on that, but I think a glimpse of the sort of international cooperation that we need. If we take another example, humanitarian response, another important area in which the United Nations has played a leadership role. Some of you may have seen just last week that Mark Lowcock, who's the UN's Emergency Response Coordinator, the head of humanitarian affairs, launched the UN appeal for $35 billion worth of humanitarian financing next year to help millions of people who will face vulnerable conditions next year, will face hunger, conflict, and the impacts of climate change. More people than the UN has ever had to deal with, an estimated 235 million people around the world. And it's a stark reminder of the potential of the UN to play a role there, but also a tragic reminder of how the rhetoric is still some way away from the reality of how we finance humanitarian response. I had the honor of serving on the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on humanitarian finance that was co-chaired by Kristalina Georgieva and the Sultan of Perak. And that was 5 years ago. And already then, there was clearly a chronic shortfall in the resources made available by rich country donors to support the UN and others in humanitarian response. But one of the lessons from that report is that we need to get far more creative about how we mobilize resources for something as critical as humanitarian interventions. That yes, the UN system and many of its partners have a fantastic track record of both raising the resources, but also delivering the interventions that are needed to respond to disaster, disease, displacement. But in the rest of the 21st century, I think we need to think far more creatively about how we involve others. How do we involve the private sector, particularly small and medium enterprises close to where disasters strike? How do we involve and empower local actors? How do we harness new financial tools? How do we use capital market interventions that might allow us to pre-finance humanitarian interventions so that we don't have to go, and the UN doesn't have to go cap in hand after disaster strikes? And I think, again, there's real need and a real gap between the resources available and the promises made, but I think an opportunity for us to rethink how we resource collective interventions on something so as critical as the humanitarian system. A third area is around how we finance sustainable development. You know, many of us are worried that the COVID shock is also going to lead to a great reversal in progress towards the sustainable development goals. And one of those key transmission mechanisms in that progress is about finance for sustainable development being redeployed. And look, let me be frank, there are some real concerns about long-term financing, whether it's on aid, on debt relief, debt cancellation. But I do think there are also some really important opportunities. You know, we've been, again, at Oxfam, part of a coalition of actors supporting a global fund for social protection. And the argument there is relatively straightforward. You know, we have all sorts of mechanisms, fiscal mechanisms at the domestic level, especially in the North, to protect each of us, to provide each of us with some form of safety net. And we've seen how important that has been during this pandemic response. But it's a timely reminder that not everyone on this planet has that luxury of being able to fall back on a safety net, that not everyone lives in a country where the fiscal system is able to support them through shocks like this. Imagine that taxi driver in Nairobi who no longer has work because of restrictions on his mobility, on his ability to carry out his business. But unfortunately, because he lives in urban Nairobi, in Kenya, where the Kenyan government is already paying more servicing debt on a monthly basis than it does on its health system or on its social protection system, he can't call on the basic safety net that you'd hope each of us on this planet should be allowed to have access to. And so perhaps it's time for us to think about a bold mechanism like a global fund for social protection that makes sure that every single human being has access to the basic necessities, something that those people who've been working on economic and social rights have been calling on for decades, but where I think there is a moment for us to have a fundamental rethink on how we finance this incredibly important aspect of sustainable development. Similarly, with the global tax system, look, we know that the only way that we're going to pay, not just for interventions like a global fund for social protection, but to fill fiscal gaps caused by coronavirus, that we need to rethink how the global taxation system works. We need to do that because the global system itself is showing its imperfections because of the way that tax havens work, because of tax loopholes that global companies are exploiting, but also because we need, I think, mechanisms that allow us to redistribute resources in far more effective ways than has hitherto happened. I hope some of you will have seen the work that Oxfam has done on income and wealth inequality around the world, highlighting the fact that we live in such horrendously unequal times where there's been vulgar, eye-watering levels of accumulation by a few, while fiscal systems around the world have not been able to access the resources they need to fight poverty or to address inequality. And we need new global responses to fixing that. We need new mechanisms to tax wealth, for example. It can't be right that only 4 cents of every dollar of tax collected around the world comes from wealth taxes. And yet we know that wealth inequality is rapidly rising around the world. And we also know that individual countries taxing wealth is unlikely to succeed because of the way that capital flows work, because of the way that wealthy people behave. And so we need a global response. And this is a fantastic opportunity for the international system to do so, to come back and create a fair way of redistributing deeply unequally allocated resources around the world. And a fourth area where I think we need to rethink how international cooperation works is around digital cooperation. I was also lucky enough to be on a second UN Secretary General's high-level panel, and it was on digital cooperation, and it was co-chaired by Jack Ma and Melinda Gates, and we produced our report last year, and it was entitled "The Age of Interdependence." And that we chose that title because some of you may know, way back in the mid-1990s, there was a famous or infamous document doing the rounds called the Declaration of Cyber Independence. And it was drafted by someone who had worked in the tech sector in the 90s, who argued that the digital era was going to be unlike any other era of human history, and that normal rules didn't apply, including, of course, the rules set by nation states. And it was a sort of brave declaration of independence by those people who were working in the cyber sphere. 20 odd years later, what's incredibly clear is that hasn't happened. That the digital revolutions, the digital transformations that we see around us have undoubtedly changed the way that we communicate, the way that we socialize, the way that we organize, the way that we consume. But it hasn't become a world apart from the real world. And in fact, you might argue that some of those inequities, those injustices, that discrimination that happens in the real world are being replicated and amplified in the digital world. And so we called our report The Age of Interdependence, because it feels like at this moment where some of those technologies feel mature and some of those habits, those opportunities and risks are becoming clearer, we need to find avenues for digital cooperation that support and reinforce that interdependence. And it feels like a moment where we need to bring together all the best of what multilateral international cooperation has brought with all the best of what multi-stakeholder cooperation has brought and can bring if we're to manage digital cooperation in the decades to come. And this is exactly the sort of convening role, perhaps even the norm-setting role, that the UN has to play, and I know wants to play, but it's going to be really important for us if we're to protect those core values of universal human rights in this new digital era. And let me just close by an anecdote of that to me summarizes our challenge and opportunity really well. That was shared to me by someone who works with Jack Ma at Alibaba. And he said the challenge for the 21st century is to think of data not as oil, as some people think of it as, or not as money as some people think of it as, but as likened to blood. That if you think about the world system being like the human body, data is like blood that pumps through the global system. Now, in order to survive and thrive, that global body needs blood to flow. And so the rest of the 21st century cannot be about protecting and limiting, stymieing the flow of that information, that data. It's got to be about allowing it to flow relatively freely, but it's about protecting organs and systems in that body from infection, from bad practices spreading. So we need to sort of channel the nurturing aspects of data while limiting the damaging aspects of those data flows. And that to me is a wonderful way of thinking about the opportunity of how we adapt global governance architecture to the digital world. And again, a fundamental reminder of how institutions like the United Nations are probably best placed to respond and lead on some of these developments. So those are just some areas, if you think about sort of vaccines and COVID response, of the humanitarian system, of financing for development, of digital cooperation, where I think we do need more meaningful international cooperations. And while there are some very strong headwinds, that there are some opportunities as well. Let me just touch briefly on the other two aspects I wanted to cover. And that first is around what some people might call the participation revolution. And if we come back to this point that it is easier for us to communicate, to organize, to mobilize, to socialize than ever before, we need to think about, well, what does that mean for those of us who believe in a rules-based international order? Well, this point was brought home to me many years ago when there was something called the World We Want, which was in some ways a predecessor to the UN 75 global consultation that Natalie and others have been leading so wonderfully. And it was as we were thinking about what would come after the Millennium Development Goals, and of course before what became the Sustainable Development Goals. And a bunch of people at UNDP, the UN Development Programme, and the UN Millennium Campaign, and others, were carrying out an effort to ask people of the world what they wanted in this new goal framework, what would be their priorities. And it was a wonderful example of consulting, of the UN system consulting directly with citizens, asking people what they thought should be important in the new global goals. And I remember a colleague at the UN saying that they got lots of criticism from diplomats, one of whom said, how dare you ask our citizens what they want? It's for us as international diplomats negotiating at the UN to decide what should be in the new global goal framework. And I thought, what a wonderful reminder of how important it's going to be to recalibrate citizen participation in the United Nations system. We are in the midst of what you might call, and what we at CIVICUS call, the double democratic deficit, that far too many people on the planet live in a national system that's hardly democratic, but all of those frustrations are replicated in the global system, where their voice is also not necessarily heard, where some of that global decision making is still happening by unelected officials sitting behind closed doors, negotiating in untransparent ways. And we need to think about, how do we bring the voice of the citizen and what each of us cares about in a meaningful and powerful way into that system. And I know there are lots of fantastic ideas, and I'm sure Natalie will talk about those. But I do think this is a really important moment for us to perhaps be radical in thinking about what the next 75 years of the United Nations system might mean from the point of view of civic participation, of this participation revolution. And whether it's bold ideas like creating an upper house of the UN system, a chamber of discourse, as Jan Dryzek calls it, or whether it's digital tools that will allow us to have more engagement with global decision makings on an everyday basis, or countless other ideas that have been talked about. I do think it's important to come back to looking at this idea. So finally, just around Britain and its role in the world. And as I said, it does feel like there's no shortage of risks in the post-Brexit moment, whether that's the risk of nationalism, of mercantilism, of neo-imperialism. But there's also opportunity. And I think this comes back to the founding moment for the United Nations, for the UNA, and for Oxfam, which is this really important set of core values that I think are at the heart of what it means to be British. And that's around international cooperation, of standing up for others, of working together for collective solutions. And I think this is a really important moment for Britain to come to play a role on the world stage that almost certainly will look unlike the role it's played for the last 75 years, but I hope nevertheless is based on certain values. We and others have been calling for a global Britain values test that should be at the heart of the integrated policy making that we hope this government will announce more details of when the integrated review is finally published, but in which we can think about those values and how we deploy both sort of diplomatic power, but all those wonderful bits of soft power that Britain is connected to in an optimistic and constructive way. And I think, there is a moment for those of us who do hold these values of internationalism dear to, I think, go beyond some of the sort of tribal politics and the divisive politics that we've seen, particularly since the Brexit referendum, and rebuild that centrist middle ground. Because yeah, yes, the foundations of support for international development are shaky. There are lots of people who are very nervous about the Brexit future. But the research that I read, the polling and focus group work that I've been seeing lately, reassures me that there is a solid center ground in the British polity that does believe in international cooperation, that does believe in Britain playing a positive and progressive role on the world stage, that does believe in Britain retaining its sort of open connections with the world on education, on trade, on mobility, on human mobility. And I think organizations like ours, like Oxfam, like the UN Association, I think have a really important role to play at this very moment in British history to underline our role in the world and to underline that notion of progressive internationalism. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to share some of those thoughts. I think I hand over to Natalie now.
Thanks so much, Danny, for thought-provoking, sobering remarks at times, but you stayed true to your aim of giving us a dose of hope as well, which I think we really all need at the end of a long year. Before I go any further, I just wanted to quickly introduce myself. My name is Natalie Sammersinger. I think many of you know me as the Executive Director of UNA UK, but I have been moonlighting a little bit for the past sort of almost 2 years now. I've been on leave of absence working for the UN in New York, helping to run the 75th anniversary initiative, which is all around launching the world's biggest conversation, trying to crowdsource priorities and solutions for the future. We'll be hearing a little bit more about that later from the Pew Research Center, one of our key partners. And actually, Danny, some of the data, you're feeling that there's a solid core of the public that supports, internationalism, solidarity, that does care about helping the hardest hit. I mean, that our data does bear that out. So hopefully those are good tools that Oxfam and UNA and others can use in the future. But let me draw in some questions, because I don't think we don't have too much time, and I have so many I'd like to ask you myself. But let me start at the beginning with something you said, looking at Oxfam's roots, the UN's roots, UNA's roots. And I think what we've seen, and this speaks to some of the questions as well, what we've seen is this move from the sort of concept of charity, of aid, of helping those less fortunate, to really, talking about social justice, talking about partnerships. Now, Oxfam, I think, seems to have managed this shift. The UN, perhaps less so to some extent. I mean, how do you think that, the UN can move in that direction when it is still effectively set up, to reflect the power structures of 1945? And linking also to your, I think, right exhortation that the UK can and should lead once again. How can it not do that in the way that it, did in the past?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it's something we're grappling with as we speak, because of course, in the context of official aid budgets being cut, particularly in the UK, as we know, those of us who are trying to raise resources to do the work you're talking about need to find them somewhere. And what's been interesting, we've just set a new strategy at Oxfam Great Britain for the next few years, is that that it seems that organizations like ours have a supporter base that's motivated both by this notion of charity, of compassion, but also this notion of solidarity, of mutuality. And I think we need a sort of good dose of both of those, because one, this idea that it's just charity, alone is not sufficient, as I think you're hinting in this question. But the other, which is that, it can't, we do need resources, and we do, especially if we're to address urgent need. One of the tragedies about the cuts in UK aid at this moment is that we know lives are going to be lost, because we know that a few million more children will go unvaccinated as a result of the UK cutting its aid budget, or a million more children will not go to school next year as a result of those aid cuts. And so I think it's trying to speak to both the sort of obligation of those of us who are lucky enough to have personal resources of our own, or lucky enough to live in countries that have high wealth, to do what we can to address poverty and exclusion, but also this idea that we need to address the sort of the structures of that drive injustice, the systems that drive injustice, and being ready to sort of deploy across both. So it's both sort of speaking to both bits of what motivates people, but also having something to show in both of those bits, if you will, so that you're taking sort of meaningful action to demonstrate a sort of impact in the world. And finally, just as I was trying to say that the sort of, you can't put the participation genie back in the bottle, I don't think you can put some of these sort of global trends back in the bottle as well. If you take the way that sort of the global economy is working, the world is going to look like a radically different place in, say, 25 years from now than it did 75 years ago. And we need an international architecture and sort of systems and mechanisms for global cooperation that will reflect that new global reality. And we can't put some of that back in the bottle. And so sort of our job, particularly those of us, who are working inside this system or these systems in some way, our job is to provide, I hope, sort of constructive, meaningful, powerful leadership towards that new architecture, that new system.
Thanks a lot for that. We'll be talking about some of the models a bit later on, but I have to ask the most upvoted question, is a very direct one, as it might not be a surprise, on the UK's abandoning its 0.7% GNI commitment. What do you think the impact will be? I mean, we can imagine what it will be on some of the world's poorest communities, but what do you think will be the impact for the UK? As well as for the world? And this is UNA, we like to campaign. What can we be doing about it?
So I think I've already talked a bit about how disastrous this move is, coming as it does in the midst of the world's worst humanitarian crisis of a generation, and it's also timing in terms of post-Brexit of projecting that global Britain, a values-based global Britain. What can we do about it? I think we it's almost certain the government has said it needs to pass primary legislation to reverse those cuts, and so therefore, this is going to be a moment when the likes of the UN Association and us and many others need to work very hard to advocate for why protecting 0.7 is important. And so the battle certainly is not lost on. It's not a foregone conclusion that this will happen in the way that it needs to happen in legislative terms. And then there's the positive argument. I think there are lots of people who see the value of aid in Britain sort of projecting itself on the world. And here we are with a government that is keen to show that side of Britain, whether it's a climate ambition summit that's about to take place, or the COP negotiations that will take place next year, or the hosting G20. I think this is going to be, there is a positive argument to be made here as well. It's not just about sort of the argument to protect aid for what it does, but it's about the importance of aid in projecting that confident, positive, values-based Britain that I think we need to, and we need to get out there now, because a vote may need to happen in the next few weeks in the British Parliament.
And hopefully some of the data I mentioned before will be of value in making that case. Just a reminder, if anyone wants to sneak in a question, I'm just going to take possibly only one or two more, because we have to wrap up soon. I am yet to see a female name in the Q&A box. It's my tradition. I only go to women, but I haven't seen anyone unless the anonymous questioner was female. So please do that. I'm going to combine a few questions really on climate change. I think one of the questions is, isn't this really the biggest challenge we face? Shouldn't everything we do really be framed in that way? I mean, lots of people had said COVID is just a precursor of the kind of disruption we'll face if we don't tackle climate change. The question also on what can we expect from this sort of summit on the 12th of December, which is supposed to be a curtain raiser for the big climate conference next year. I mean, how is Oxfam has really been placing a lot of emphasis on climate change. what do you think we can expect from the summit? Should we really just be talking about that now?
Well, look, we are taking it very seriously. So that new strategy that I mentioned, which I'm happy to share the link to during this meeting, puts climate justice as one of the issues that Oxfam Great Britain will work on over the next few years, because we do recognize that intersection between poverty and climate insecurity is already severe in many parts of the world. But it's only going to get worse as the impacts of climate breakdown wreak havoc on the lives of farmers, on people living in low-lying parts of the world, places where there's water scarcity. And so this is a priority, and people who are asking about that I think are right to recognize that. I think for us it's an important issue because it comes back to sort of reminding us of how deeply interconnected we are, and therefore our obligation to do something about sort of addressing vulnerability. Tomorrow Oxfam will be publishing some new research that shows how unequal emissions are. In the UK, we're going to be showing the proportion of carbon emissions caused by the lifestyles of the wealthiest. But of course, at the global level, we know that the richest people on the planet have been most responsible for climate breakdown, and the poorest majority have had almost nothing to do with the state of where we are. And that just seems wrong, and we need to, I think, mobilize and deploy. And again, use this as an argument to underline why international collaboration or cooperation is so important. This isn't just a sort of sideshow, if you will. And just to close on this, the Climate Ambition Summit and the COP next year, I think it's great that the UK government is showing some leadership on its own ambitious targets. Excuse me. I think it's really important that that's followed by action and by investment, particularly if you're interested in the impacts on the rest of the world, on meeting some of those promises around climate finance. Not just the UK, but many other northern governments have promised tens of billions of pounds worth of climate finance. But if you start to look at discount those that are in the form of loans and those that don't go into interventions that help developing countries with adaptation or mitigation, you're left with a tiny amount of the promises or the pledges that have been made that's actually going to meet the obligations on climate finance in the developing world. And so I think there is again, for those of us who live in the UK, who are part of society here, I think there is an urgent need for us to draw out both those connections between, say, poverty and climate breakdown, but also the importance of joined up action on those fronts, and seeing that sort of intersectionality, if I can use that word, or the interconnectedness, is hugely important. And that comes back to, I suppose, common ground here, which is how do we build back that centrist internationalist polity that can then support meaningful action, further action on poverty, climate justice, or any other of these issues that we've just talked about.
Thanks so much, Danny. We do have a question from a lady from Patricia in Northern Ireland who wants to know how civil society can get more involved. I think you've covered that in some ways. I think also we're already collaborating, UNA, with your team. Maybe we can share some ideas on, the people's vaccine, the climate, summit on the 0.7% legislation, and circulate those to everyone. I think that would be a great way to join up some of our efforts. But let me ask you just one final question then, because the UN 75 consultation, asked everyone sort of what is the one thing you would say to the Secretary General that he really should focus on with all the challenges he faces. There's no such thing as a silver bullet, but if there were, what's the closest thing in your view?
I think there is on digital cooperation, I think there is there's an opportunity to experiment with that mashing up of multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism, if you will. I think, in our report, the high-level panel suggested using the Internet Governance Forum as the model to create this sort of next generation of international architecture. And I think the digital sphere urgently needs meaningful rules-based collaboration. It also urgently, it's an urgent set of benefits that will be rolled out if we get this right. So it's, I think there's something there that, it's been notoriously difficult in recent years for the UN to play a meaningful role because of how different member states are acting when it comes to the digital sphere, of how powerful the private sector is when it comes to the digital marketplace. But I think it's, the sort of payoff of doing something, even if it's small, if it's a first step of a meaningful UN sort of intervention in digital cooperation, I think the impact and the payoff in generations to come will be huge.
Thanks so much, Danny. And I think it's one of those challenges, if the UN ignores, it's going to just lose relevance. But thank you so much for giving so generously of your time and an evening. Thanks for everything you're doing. And yeah, we really look forward to working closely with Oxfam in the difficult months ahead to achieve some of what you've outlined today. But thank you so much. And thanks everyone for the questions. We unfortunately didn't have a lot of time to get through absolutely everything, but maybe we can address some of them in the later session as well. We're going to take about 5 minutes now just to have a little break, comfort break, stretch legs, get another cup of coffee and so on. But we will reconvene in about 5 minutes and then hear from our brilliant guests from the Pew Research Center.
if there was, there's plenty of what ifs.
What if we didn't have corruption,
persecuciones o guerras,
HIV,
ageism,
discrimination,
stigma.
ماذا لو فهم الجميع في العالم معنى أن تكون مهاجراً بعيداً عن أهلك، بعيداً عن ناسك، بعيداً عن وطنك؟
I always think, what if my home just disappears? What if my whole country disappears? And what if my daughter never gets to see it?
What if the world was cleaner?
What if my child could grow up in a world where climate change wasn't a constant threat and where cities were pollution-free?
أمنيتي لها خاصة بعدل الفرق بين المدينة وبرات المدينة.
Tous les jours, on voit les villes grandir, on voit un exode rural des populations, et cela vient avec beaucoup de problèmes, des problèmes de logement, des problèmes d'insalubrité, des problèmes de santé publique.
By 2050, globally, there will be more people over the age of 60 than children.
So we need to plan for age-friendly cities.
Но это единственным образом можно решить. Один шаг за шагом.
There's so many people that have nothing, and there's so few people that have a lot. And you think about inequality, it's so important to understand that we need a world that is more equal.
What if we lived in a world where all that mattered was how we cared about each other?
We're all deserving of the same kind of care and love and health and education. And these are just all basic necessities that we should all have access to.
世界上的贫富差距应该可以减少，而且将会有更多的工作机会给新的一代。
New technology can do things that are completely undreamt of. What if it was used for bringing education to rural areas?
Tout ce que je suis devenu, c'est vraiment cette éducation que j'ai reçue à la base. Et je pense que si moi je peux accéder à cette éducation, tous les enfants du monde doivent avoir accès à ça aussi.
如果全世界一起合作，打造一个共享的网络空间，那么所有人都能够参与数字经济。
¿Qué tal si en el mundo nos escucháramos?
When we bring our minds together, those ideas become innovation.
I think my only what if out of many what ifs would be, what if every young person was empowered to reach their full potential?
What if the world was a more secure place for young people like me?
Мы все в этом мире временные. Y у нас есть путь выбрать.
Cuando digo que hace falta solidaridad entre países, también es solidaridad entre las personas.
What if all the nations understand that we are so powerful? We should be the instrument of peace. We should be the peace.
What if leaders and communities would understand that they should use dialogue and not conflict to address their differences?
Si c'est possible.
Do I think this is possible? Yes, because I'm an optimist.
I'm an optimist.
We need your opinions, your strategies, your ideas for us to be able to deliver better for the people of the world that we must serve.
We can change this game.
It is absolutely essential that you all join the conversation.
Everybody has to contribute. We don't have an option.
Everybody needs to talk. We need to come together.
What would the world be like?
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. That film was created by my colleagues at the UN last year, when I think we were probably feeling a little bit more optimistic about what 2020 would hold. This was going to be the sort of super year for climate and the environment, with the COP26 conference, the Biodiversity Summit. Was going to be a year to really make progress on women's rights, on women's empowerment after really kind of progress going in the wrong direction over many years. And it was supposed to be the start of the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals. So we had high hopes for this year. Obviously, everything the UN has been doing has been affected by COVID-19. And, we really did a lot of soul searching about, what should this UN 75 anniversary really be about? And we thought, should we backpedal a bit? Should we put less emphasis on it? Should we really focus on COVID response and recovery? And we came to the conclusion that actually the conversation we wanted to start, which you saw presented in that film, was part of the UN's COVID response, because we needed to give people a voice at a time when decisions are taken that will, really affect us for generations to come. And vast sums of money are being spent. Sums of money we were always told are not really available for development, not available for human rights, not available for climate. Suddenly they were, available. And we felt it was really, really valuable to give people the chance to say, this is how we see recovery from COVID, and this is what we want to see in the future. And really building on, what Danny mentioned earlier, the big consultation to inform the Sustainable Development Goals, which was wonderful and pioneering, but it was quite, it was a list of issues: education, health, gender equality, which ones do you care about? Whereas we tried to go a little bit deeper and say, what are your hopes and fears around the challenges that we face? What solutions and ideas do you have that we should be taking into account? We really wanted to have a proper conversation, a dialogue. That was obviously very difficult with the pandemic. We initially envisaged having these conversations within and between different communities, bringing people together who had different opinions, who can often seem that they come from different planets. We were able to move some of that online. We were able to put in place some measures to reach people who don't have online access, by having phone dialogues, socially distanced dialogues, by getting partners on the ground to reach out to very remote areas. I think we managed to reach 120 countries, had about 3,500 dialogues. But really we thought, okay, how else can we engage people? And, we put a lot of emphasis on a survey that I hope everyone watching this has taken. If not, there's still about a month left to the end of the year or so to take it. We put that out again online and offline through different channels. But we were also really keen not just to reach those who were within our networks, those who are predisposed to be interested in global cooperation, to be sympathetic towards the UN. And that's really where our partnership with the Pew Research Center comes in, and why it was so important. We wanted to ensure that we had representative surveys that really reflected the population in different countries, that made sure we were reaching out across the board to people, really as a bit of a reality check, to make sure it wasn't just the UN community preaching to itself and saying, yes, we really care about all these issues. So, Pew have been a fantastic partner to us, really helping us to shape our surveys, really how we go about crafting these questions, approaching topics and so on. And crucially, they also carried out some polling for us, including in the UK. And this is what I was alluding to earlier. Hopefully, those of us who want to, really campaign on some of these issues and who want some evidence to back up, I think, what we often feel inside, that yes, people are sympathetic to these values. People do care about cooperation. They do care about the UN. They do care about development and helping others. Hopefully, we'll have some data to be backing this up. So it's absolutely fantastic that we have James Bell with us today. He is just sort of Mr. Survey in my mind. He can really take us through the results, but also hopefully we can have a wider conversation also about the value of polling and how it can really be used by organizations like the UN, but also NGOs like UNA UK. So absolute pleasure to have you, Jeb. Really nice to see you, and over to you.
Thank you, Natalie. thank you everyone for inviting me to be part of this annual conference. I was very pleased to be able to join and to listen in, especially on Danny's remarks. He covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate him including in his comments references to the voices of citizens, how we engage and empower citizens as a challenge and a question before this group and others who care about the future of international cooperation. That's part of what we were trying to explore in our modest role in this larger endeavor that Natalie, Fabrizio Hauschild, and others were spearheading, in part because we're genuinely at the Pew Research Center interested and believe it's important to understand how do you listen to the voices of citizens. That's core to our mission. Before I get into the presentation, and I will try to be relatively brief to allow for discussion, questions and answers, and give Natalie a chance to probe a bit more some of the findings from our work. I just want to say, as an organization, the UNA UK, and Natalie doesn't know I'm about to say this, should be very proud of Natalie's leadership. It's just been so impressive. She hinted at all the challenges that came her way and UN 75 initiative's way because of COVID-19. And she's just been outstanding and an outstanding partner to Pew Research Center. And we've been just so happy to be part of this. And I've learned so much in this process, not just about the UN as an institution, but really about some of the core issues that the Secretary General, Natalie, Fabrizio, and others in leadership positions are really trying to bring to the foreground in terms of discussions and policy decisions. So again, thanks to Natalie, really fantastic for us to be working with her. And we were really pleased, just to be clear, I'll say in my presentation a few words about the Pew Research Center, an organization that may or may not be known to this group all that well, but we are a nonprofit research organization. We're funded mainly by a parent organization that's also a nonprofit, Pew Charitable Trust. And we were just really pleased to take that investment in a public good and direct it towards this initiative, the UN 75 initiative. This is all pro bono on our part because the two, the initiative and our ongoing mission really aligned on this. So just fantastic to be doing this together. So now I'd like to share some of the key highlights from our global findings, so to speak, not highlighting UK per se, but when we get to Q&A, if there are questions that are specific to UK, happy to try to address those. I'll cover just really the highlights. And there's a couple moments that I'm hoping the technology makes it possible to ask this audience a couple questions, perhaps very obvious in terms of where you will land on at least one of these questions, but give you a sense for some of the issues that we were asking our respondents about in different parts of the world. So now I'm going to try to pull up my presentation and see how this goes. Every program has a different set of commands. So I'm making sure I know what I'm doing now, and I apologize. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right. So hopefully everyone can see it. And if anyone cannot see it, please let me know. The title of the presentation, as you can see here, is about international cooperation. Again, this was a study done in conjunction with the UN 75 initiative, so that's the core theme. We did ask questions about the United Nations as an organization, as a promoter of international cooperation, and we did try to ask not only, great softball questions, don't you like the UN, but we actually tried to probe a bit deeper. What are some of the challenges? What are some of the priorities that the UN and other multilateral organizations need to be focused on? So again, not sure how familiar people are with the Pew Research Center. I'm not going to read this word for word. I'm happy to make this presentation available to UNA UK after the conference today, so you can look at it at your leisure. But just to stress, we're not only non-profit, we're nonpartisan. You hear that a lot in DC if you ever happen to be over this way. But more importantly, we're non-advocacy. So we're not promoting any particular agenda, any particular policy outcome. That makes us a bit different than some of the think tanks you may be familiar with. As I said, we're funded primarily from the Pew Charitable Trust, also a nonprofit. And we're really focused on providing impartial research and data that can help drive a conversation, help inform decisions. Again, we're not advocating for a particular outcome, but we do believe in the importance of facts and rigorous research. And I think Natalie put it nicely. We do our best, in this case included, to be a reality check and to help a process by being that reality check. And we do believe in this last bullet in public dialogue, which is another reason we're just so excited to be part of this UN 75 initiative, because it is at its core about dialogue, about how to engage citizens in a conversation about, as Danny said back in the day from the previous kind of effort, what is the world we want? What do people expect the world to look like? What are their main concerns, and what do they propose that we do to create a better future for all of us? So again, dialogue is key. Making facts and data relevant to the dialogue is our mission. Just so you know, as Natalie said, and as I think we all know, and many of us have had direct connections to the tragic consequences of COVID-19, at a global scale, it changed everything. And for us, heading into UN 75 initiative and being a partner with the UN on this initiative, we were hoping to be active in our public opinion research role in 50 countries. It was going to be fantastic. COVID-19 arrived just as we were as we began field work, to be honest. And we soon, in a matter of a week or so, realized that the public health risk of us continuing our work, which in the global South is done 100% face-to-face still, we still knock on doors, our local partners do, I should say, to conduct our surveys. We couldn't do that. So we regrouped and we focused on countries where we felt very confident about polling in a random scientific way by telephone. And we chose to focus on 14 countries. Very big change in scale, but we chose 14 countries that are among the top 20 donors to the United Nations. We felt this was a very meaningful group of countries where we could look at public opinion and consider in these countries that are these major donors to the UN, what are the publics? What are the citizens and what are the voters saying to their elected government and officials about the importance of international cooperation and sustaining commitments to the UN and other international efforts? And so we decided to focus on these 14. It is not the entire globe. And fortunately, Natalie and UN 75 Initiative were able to bring another partner in for additional research in the Global South, and that was Edelman. And Edelman had a network for phone polling in the Global South that we don't have on our own, and they brought that to bear. So there will be moments in the presentation today where I'll bring some of what Edelman found into this picture as well. And just to paint a picture of all the data that goes into UN 75, and it's pretty amazing. You have the dialogues that Natalie mentioned. You have the online survey conducted by the United Nations. You have our polling. You have Edelman's polling, and you have Edelman doing social media and media analysis. So hats off to the UN 75 Initiative for really thinking about how do you bring multiple streams of data to bear on some of the questions that we're talking about. For our slice, the Pew Research Center, again, we focused on 14 countries. You'll see them listed here. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize them. Two things to point out. The United Kingdom is among them, and you'll see these countries mentioned elsewhere, but these are the 14. Definitely focus on advanced economies, many in Europe, some in Asia, as you can see here, and it includes the United States and Canada as well. All scientific, random probability polling, representative of the national population in these countries, more than 14,000 adults in total surveyed. And this was done in July and August, from June through August, I should say, of this past summer. So it's fresh in some ways, but we all know the world changes quickly these days. And in the era of COVID-19, with the vaccine on the way, we are actually going to go back in the field this spring on our own independently, but we're going to be happy to bring our updated findings from this spring to bear on this continuing conversation about the UN and international cooperation. So I actually should go back for a second. And this is if I have the technology available. This is where I would like to pose the first question. I don't know if Chris or whoever on the team at the UN is there. So this is the first, well, we're going to do both, I guess. This is the best time to ask this question. So we have two questions here. The first one's about sort of the cost of international cooperation in tackling international issues. Should our country take into account the interests of other countries, even if it means making compromises with them? Or alternately, should our country follow its own interests when tackling major international issues? even if other countries strongly agree. So that's the first question we're going to ask you to respond to. And I think the idea is that you'll do that now before I read the next question. And I say that not seeing or knowing if anyone technologically sophisticated about this is there telling people what to do and how to do it. And there's Natalie. I see one living person.
I can confirm the poll has popped up, that I've taken it, and I'm sure we'll be informed of the results shortly.
Thank you, Natalie. It's very unnerving to look at a blank screen sometimes.
Yeah.
I'll give people a few more seconds. And then the second question, very straightforward, but it has bearing on one of the findings I'll share later in this presentation. And as we asked a series of things. This is why you have an ellipsis in this question, but just this one aspect. Just share your thoughts, whether you think it's true or not that the United Nations cares about the needs of ordinary people, yes or no. And then the benefit of having you answer these questions is that we'll be able to give you a sense for how this group as an audience compares with some of the findings we have from our own survey in the 14 countries. And I will be relying on my wonderful colleagues at UK to make those findings available at those moments when I think I will call them out. All right, thanks Chris and team. And where are we here? Okay, the results are in. Now, this is absolutely nothing like our actual polling process in which we wait weeks for results. This is amazing. So we can see here an overwhelming percentage of this audience are strongly in favor of the idea of compromise with the goal of solving international issues, even if that means taking the interests of other countries into account, kind of deprioritizing our own country's interests. It's a 97.3% split. That is basically universal opinion in this group. With all respect to those who differ in their opinion, that is clearly the overwhelming result. Just about the same level of belief that the UN does take the care about the needs of ordinary people. And what I will highlight in a few minutes is, on one hand, we're going to see that overall publics in the countries we surveyed, as well as in some of the global South countries that Edelman covered in support of UN 75, would agree that as a matter of mission, the UN is focused on matters and issues that matter to ordinary people. Question is whether it really understands the needs of ordinary people. So we'll come back to that in the presentation, but thank you all for taking these questions. Keep these in mind. You're a very special group of people, wonderfully special people. See how you compare with the publics as we go through these results. All right, thanks Chris and team. Moving on then, if I may, to the next slide. I have to close this. There it goes, thanks. I hope I can do. And there we go. So there are really 5 key findings that I'd like to really bring home for this audience. And as we go through, and you'll see different sets of data, different percentages, you'll see a few different images. By the time we get done with the briefing, you may be a bit like, what did all that add up to? So let me just highlight the 5 things that I think, as a public opinion researcher and as someone who worked closely with Natalie and the team, think about the questions we want to put to people. 5 things that I took away from the study. And you may see other things or have questions about other aspects, and we can get into those as well. Number 1 is what you see in front of you. That in many ways, if you think about the year of COVID-19 that we've had globally, I think it's arguably reasonable to call it a test of public support for international cooperation. And at least in the countries where Pew Research Center polled, through to August, we definitely saw that international cooperation, public support for international cooperation, had survived the pandemic. And this is not a given. Now you may think, oh, well, who wouldn't say we should cooperate? Who wouldn't say we should band together to fight this pandemic? Because it's a global pandemic. But in fact, on this line, you see these different shadings. Those represent country results. Not all our countries aligned on this issue. The median, the middle score, is the 59% clear majority saying yes, international cooperation would have made it possible to have fewer cases of coronavirus in our country. an indication of support for international cooperation, the value of international cooperation, but it's not the case that every public agreed to the same degree, and some actually had major doubts. Japan stands out as a country that was not satisfied with the handling of the COVID-19 by the WHO, for example. And so my point there only is it's not a given. And so this result is meaningful, that in a year in which the world was tested and continues to be tested by the pandemic, we do find the majority of public support in favor of international cooperation, its value. And I'll share a couple more. I'll share this point one more time and I add another one to it. So you can see what I just shared. The second bullet point on the right-hand side, more say that international cooperation would have, international cooperation would have reduced the impacts of COVID-19 in their own country. So more cooperation would have been better for their country. And you see about the same percentage, 6 in 10, saying the WHO has done a good job dealing with the pandemic. And so again, as a test, the pandemic is one that the UN, or at least the WHO, passed overall, and that overall people believe that international cooperation would have actually, more of it would have helped reduce the impact of the pandemic. So passing the test, so to speak. The other key points I want to hit as we go through this is that the UN is recognized for its core mission, that there are some major challenges that publics generally talk about when it comes to long-term goals and challenges and important priorities for the UN and international community, that there is a challenge in engaging citizens, as Danny referenced earlier, and that possibly a key resource as we move forward will be younger people. So each of those I'll highlight in just a few minutes. So I just mentioned that the UN is respected for its mission. You saw the findings for the WHO, roughly 6 in 10 saying the WHO did a good job handling the pandemic. But when we talk about the UN as an institution, we asked about what does the United Nations do? Not just like, is it good or favorable? We asked that, but really got into what does it do? And we found that majorities clearly thought the United Nations was acting to promote peace and security in the world, human rights, and sustainable development. Those are 3 core elements of the UN's mission. So that's good news. And the UN is valued and seen favorably by 6 in 10 or more in most of the countries we surveyed. Edelman saw that in the year of pandemic of COVID-19, that the United Nations and the Global South countries they looked at, public opinion said the UN mattered even more. So both Global North, both Global South see a value in the UN and its mission, a value in its role in the world. So that's definitely good news. But the UN is not always seen as delivering results. And we'll get to that in a second. But here are 2 data points for you to consider. When I mention about that core mission, you see that 76% of respondents in our 14 countries that we poll say that that is something the UN does. It promotes human rights. And that almost the same percentage, 3/4 of our respondents across these countries are saying that UN also promotes peace. But it's not always seen as delivering results. I mean, how do you put these 2 together? How does it get credit for promoting something, taking action on its core activities, and not delivering results? I think part of the challenge in terms of interpreting those results is that seeing results versus knowing what the UN is doing are not exactly the same. And seeing the results is something that people do want. They want to know that there's some accountability, and we'll come back to that later. But where do people want to see those results? Where do they say there are results needed that they can point to and say, yes, there is progress being made? And one of the things that really stood out to me in this set of data from these 14 countries is how in the year of COVID-19, when I actually going into this survey thought it's possible that though no other issue will register with people as a top global threat, only COVID-19, only infectious disease spread will be at the top. Climate change is right there with the spread of infectious disease. It has not diminished in importance, even as, and we've looked at this over time, what are the top global threats? Infectious disease has risen to a level not seen before, not surprising, but it hasn't displaced climate change as a top global concern. And Edelman, when they looked in the Global South, yes, in the immediate coming months, health, poverty, jobs, these basic concerns are paramount when the publics are asked about what's their top concern. But when Edelman asks, in the long term, what are the most pressing issues that concern you? Again, climate change emerges as a top concern. So we're seeing it again, not in just the countries that Pew Research Center surveyed, but also what Edelman saw in the Global South. To give you the specific numbers, here you go. Now, this image is not arbitrary, by the way. This is from Madrid, Spain, during some of the early weeks of the pandemic, when there was a scheduled protest against global warming in favor of reining in climate change, and people couldn't gather in person. So they put their shoes in a public plaza as part of what would have been their public protest because of the pandemic. So somewhat poetically, I thought this was a great image to express how both are part of the reality for people. Both are top concerns. Essentially, an identical percentage in the 14 countries who were surveyed, 7 in 10 roughly, say the top global threat that could affect their country is either climate change or the spread of infectious disease around the globe. So we know that the UN is valued. We know that publics have some priorities. So what's the problem? Just line up the UN with those priorities and get the job done. Now, I'm being obviously facetious. There's many considerations, but one is that of all the things we asked about the UN that it does or does not do, the least common response in terms of what the UN does is connect with citizens and understand their needs. So in our 14-country poll, only just over half, 53%, say that the UN understands the needs of average citizens. And Edelman, when it talked about what do people want from the UN as citizens, they want some of the things that Danny was talking about earlier. They want transparency, they want accountability, and they want inclusivity. And they're not necessarily seeing those today. So this is part of what I was talking about earlier as a challenge that we're seeing coming out of our polling, and that done by Edelman as well. Now, I want to add something, because there's a way that we could just talk about the United Nations, say, oh, this is a symptom of the UN and the way it is, and the UN needs a reform. I'm going to leave that for others. Again, I'm not advocacy, but I just want to share with this group that it may not be just the UN that faces this challenge. It may be a multilateral organization challenge, because we've asked very similar questions about the EU over the past decade. And it scores very well on its core mission with public recognition of it providing peace and security and prosperity when there isn't economic challenging times in Europe. But at the same time, it scores consistently low on connecting with citizens. And that is even an institution, the EU, that has a formal mechanism, the Parliament, for representing the interests of citizens. So don't make this only about the UN is my encouragement to you. Think about the broader context, the broader challenge for multilateral organizations. And here's the finding I was just sharing. Only 53% from our poll say the UN cares about the needs of ordinary citizens. That's the middle score. Some have a more favorable opinion of how it addresses citizens' concerns. Some have a lower opinion, but this is the middle score, 53%. The lowest among a series of things we asked about, like promoting peace, protecting human rights, this was the least frequent response in terms of something UN does consistently. So let me finish with a more hopeful, optimistic note. I saw that was a pattern in Danny's comments and comments made so far. We know there are challenges. What are some of the more hopeful aspects of what we found in our survey research? And one is that young people in general tend to be more supportive of international engagement, more favorable towards the United Nations, more convinced that international cooperation would have helped mitigate the impacts of COVID-19, even this past summer. So I leave that with you as a potential resource, and to give you some sense for the scale of this difference. It's consistent across a number of measures that were included in our survey, where you have the 18 to 29-year-olds, who we consider young adults, more favorable to the United Nations in this case, more convinced the WHO did a good job handling the pandemic, and more believing that cooperation, more international cooperation, would have helped mitigate the impact of the pandemic. So something to think about. How do we engage was a question that Danny asked. How do we get people engaged and empowered? In that context, what role maybe could young people play to an outsized degree compared to other groups in a population? Leave you with that. Here's our information. I'll make sure the presentation is available to Natalie and company, and look forward to having discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jeb. There's a lot I want to jump into, and I can see there are questions coming in, but do please leave your questions via the Q&A function. Upvote those that reflect, what you're going to say. It makes it easier for me to combine a few. But I want to start off just by reinforcing a little bit of what you said, Jeb, in terms of what we did this year, because a lot of the questions are sort of, why did you focus on donor countries and so on. So just to reiterate, the UN 75 initiative had 5 ways in which we tried to collect data from the public. So the first was something where we thought, let's have the lowest possible bar for people to participate, make it as easy as possible for people to share their views. So we created this online survey that we translated into 64 languages, and then really put a lot of effort also into reaching offline audiences, which was very, very hard. We worked through SMS, we did phone, actually traditional phone calls. We had, volunteers going out to rural areas, to, indigenous communities, engaging street kids, really going out with a pen and a paper, or sometimes an iPad that could gather data offline to really make sure we heard those voices. And we have, 1.3 million people roughly who took part. And I think it's a good 1/5 of those who haven't completed the primary education. And even if you allow for those younger who did it, I think it's a decent indication of us being able to reach out more broadly. We then had the dialogues. I think I mentioned about 3,500 in 120 countries. We had the research that Pew just talked us through. Also the research done by Edelman, which was done in 36 countries, most of which were developing countries. So we have together sort of some form of representative survey in 50 countries. And then we did media analysis. So looking over the period of a year, print, broadcast, online, and social media analysis in 70 countries. And then finally, we did a sort of research mapping. So we looked at think tanks, NGOs, and not just sort of the traditional networks, also kind of youth groups, who's really talking about these conversations, what are they saying? And we looked in 6 different languages, some local languages as well, really looking at, what are the ideas coming from the more kind of expert communities, which are by no means sympathetic to the UN, but a lot of the criticism came from those communities. So I think it's always going to be imperfect. It was a year-long initiative in a very difficult year. But we think, roughly 1.5 million people in all UN member states and observer states and other territories took part in this initiative in some way. And we estimated reach of about 50 to 60 million. We're still crunching some figures in terms of who inputted through another organization or through our partners. So that's just to give a little bit of context. But I'm going to dive in there and actually pick up on one of those questions, and one of the things I mentioned, and put it to you as well, Jeff. How can we, in this world of polling and surveys, when it's so easy to do things online, and it was actually, I think you are the sort of most rigorous company I've ever come across, and in a really good way. But what are you really doing to see, how we can overcome the digital divide? And it's still about, half the world or so really doesn't have reliable digital access. How do you think we can go about this? What would you advise the UN to do in the future as well?
Thanks. Well, this is a challenging issue, because I think if people thought about the world that they either know directly, because I assume people in this audience are some of the people that probably have traveled and seen in person different parts of the globe, also what we see through the media, I think many of us would say, doesn't everyone have a smartphone by today? And if they don't have if they don't have a smartphone, don't they have a feature phone that's pretty capable of different kinds of communication like SMS? And the answer clearly is yes. What I think, and prior to UN 75 initiative, my main engagement with the UN had been with the International Telecommunications Union, which is the primary collector of data on the penetration of internet access and mobile phones. And in conversations with them and in some of our own research, what I would offer in response to your question, Natalie, is it's one thing to have the penetration and access to the technology. It's another to understand how people use it, their facility for using it, and really how it is part of their lives. And so to the degree that we've been able at the Pew Research Center, that's been one of the key areas that we've looked at in the past decade is how are people using technology and what role does it play in their lives? And it's an area, to your point, we need to explore more because that's what's going to open the door to using that technology as a platform for engaging citizens. The fact that someone has a mobile phone is not enough if it isn't really a viable way to engage them as citizens, besides the other ways they use it for their social connections in finding work or conducting their work, as many of us are using technology today. And this issue of the digital divide, also to your point, came out of sources, not just our research, really, it came out of other sources in UN 75 initiative, and it's hugely important. And I have to say, some of what Danny's comments made me a little uneasy because I thought about our own country here in the United States, economically advanced, but I was just reading today, newspaper reports about, and I have children in school, in public school, how internet access is creating digital divides today in an advanced economy under conditions of this pandemic. So you're absolutely correct, we have to figure this out. But if we want to use the technology, we actually have to understand how it is being used, or else we won't be able to use it effectively for the things we've been talking about.
Thanks. I think that's a really valuable point. And one of the issues that's emerged is the extent to which people now think of digital access as a basic need, which was kind of an interesting finding out of came out of our report. I'm going to ask one more general question about polling because we have you here. I think the value of polling obviously is opinion changing over time. So we have some questions really about, how can we build on this, make this a valuable initiative going forward, but also looking backwards, whether there is comparative data. And, you've been doing this sort of, thing for years on say how pandemics and infectious diseases featured amongst global priorities before COVID. I think you mentioned climate as being kind of pretty consistent, but do you have any reflections on diseases or maybe some of the other threats? Like how has the landscape changed?
I think in the current data that we collected in support of UN 75, and then you're very kind to point out our trends, which is a valuable part of how we can interpret this current data. There are different things I would like to highlight. So let me think about what would be most important. One is coming right out of this data, been a lot of attention. If you look at our report, we can make it available if it already hasn't been shared. I mean, Japan's such an outlier. And so in our data, I emphasize kind of the convergence and the middle score. But Japan is an outlier, and it's also instructive. It's an outlier based on our data. It seems to be the case that they don't think their country's interest was taken into account in how the WHO handled the pandemic. They don't approve of how the WHO handled the pandemic. And one of the consequences appears to be, when we look at our data, that is a driving factor in why we have this upswing in negative attitudes among Japanese towards the United Nations. I mean, a dramatic upswing. We don't see it in any other country. But this is also a country, Japan, that when they suffered their terrible earthquake in 2011, and the international community and UN came to their rescue, we saw an upswing in a positive direction. What I'm trying to say is that events in some countries can change public attitudes. And the question is whether in a country like Japan, is that the beginning of a new trend? Or is that a momentary bubble, so to speak, or inflection point? In 2011, positive attitudes then started to ease off. They remained positive, but they didn't have that same level of positivity right after the earthquake and the international rescue operations, relief operations. So that's one thing. Events can matter. So pandemic, event, crisis. What have we seen historically in some of our data? I guess the closest thing I would say and try to put in a multilateral institutional context would be EU, attitudes in Europe towards the EU with the great financial crisis, the global financial crisis, 2008-9. EU struggled in terms of public confidence in its ability to deal with that crisis. It was the #1 issue on people's minds, and the EU was being evaluated in part or largely through that lens. Opinion of the EU has improved in recent years. I have to tell you, our data would suggest driven in part by Brexit, because people have rallied around the EU, so let's not forget that. But I think also the financial crisis subsided, and people were less concerned about the EU handling that. So I'll put those two together and just say a moment of crisis like the pandemic, and not unrelated to what Danny was saying, is, and what I said, a test. As of August of this past summer, UN and WHO were getting positive, better than passing marks on how they were handling the crisis. Now we're moving in this new phase, and we'll have more data coming from the spring. It will be important to see trend-wise, is this a crisis moment that leads to a different assessment or continues to convince people that international cooperation is vital?
And hopefully the UN will remain a partner. I mean, certainly one of our big recommendations from the UN 75 team is that the UN does regular polling. It doesn't always have to be on this scale, but I think it's been hugely valuable, just in terms of providing a base level of data, which we don't have and which we should have. I'm going to ask a little bit more about the UK in particular. Obviously, that was the interest and focus of many of our members. Also, how there are questions about how we can use the data, which is not quite your territory. But you talked about Japan being an outlier. What were your reflections on what's really come out of the UK? Is there anything that you think would be of particular note that we can really kind of latch onto here?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. Really, again, wonderful to listen to Danny's comments. Obviously, I'm not as well versed as you and he in the politics of the UK when it comes to international engagement. But our data would suggest that the UK, among the countries we polled, is right there at or above that median score that I kept emphasizing in terms of support for international engagement as a public, as a whole. Now, we do see people that are sympathetic to the views of a party like the Brexit Party being much more skeptical about international engagement, but as a whole, the UK public is clearly in favor of being part of an international community and cooperating. And I would say, if you just look at it ideologically, and we do know enough from our polling, there's a big difference between talking about people who are pro and anti-Brexit versus left-right. But if we talk about left-right differences for a moment, to give you some comparison, in the United States, if you use the left-right comparison, you would have a 34 percentage point difference in levels of support for acting as part of a global community, with the right being 56% versus the left 90%. In the UK, it's 92% of the left say we should be part of an international community. It's 73% of the right who say that. So the degree of difference, ideologically right-left, is not as significant as we see in the United States, and not the big difference, as big a difference as you might see against pro and anti-Brexit stances. So point is, there are differences in the UK, but overall it's a public that, at least when we were asking these questions June through August this past summer, were telling us consistently across different measures that they wanted to be involved. They valued the UN, they valued international cooperation.
That's quite startling, actually, and it'd be really interesting also to look at some of those gaps in other countries. I think for us, it was fascinating to see Japan as an outlier, because regionally, East Asia had the highest levels of support and knowledge about the UN. Whereas, we sometimes think it's the places where the UN is the most active, say on the ground in South Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, where people have the highest knowledge visibility, and that wasn't borne out at all by the global figures. So there's a few questions here that are really about, I guess, when polling gets it right, gets it wrong, what do all these different polls mean, which poll is right, etc. What would you say, if you're advising, an organization like the UN on how best to make use of this data, and I can answer the question on how will the UN use the data in practice, this set. What do you really say to them? Like, how best do you involve polling as a sort of strategy with outreach to inform your policy making? What do you advise organizations like the UN or or what would you advise civil society groups like UNA?
So polling is one of those terms that encompasses a lot and probably has connotations that vary also. So when I think about polling, I personally I'm thinking about the research that we do at the center, which is really focused on the public as a whole. So that occasionally, especially in the United States, where we have our roots, we'll talk about voters, but globally, we are typically talking about a representative survey of all citizens and trying to get past that digital divide you were referencing earlier, especially when we're active, which is most years in the global South, we're surveying 30 plus countries most years. We want to make sure that we aren't only sampling, aren't only surveying the better educated, the better connected online, et cetera, because their views matter, but they're not necessarily representative of everyone's views. And I do think there are complications when you rely only on internet polling and there are significant digital differences, divides in a country, and you try to adjust after your survey is done by weighting, as they say, if people are familiar with that, adjusting to the population demographics, that's nice, but the people in your survey actually have to be representative of the population. So we're trying to make sure we really include the voices of the full range of citizens in a country. And when you do that, I think one of the best uses of that kind of investment, and it's not a small investment, time, energy, or resources, is to think of it as setting the strategic context for the kinds of actions that UN 75 might consider, or the UN may consider going forward, other organizations. It's a time to really, you all want to pose questions, you want to structure a conversation with people, but it is that listening opportunity that I think Danny was referencing that is vital. Take advantage of the chance to listen. So, if you want a message test, if you want to try out different approaches of engaging audiences, I think you have more options then. You can be more targeted. It doesn't necessarily even have to be representative of a whole population. You can say, these kinds of people I think will be able to reach this way, so let's see if this works for them. But in terms of basic strategic orientation and really listening to the widest variety and range of people in a country and countries, that's the kind of polling that I think the center prides itself on doing well and making available as a public good.
Thanks so much, Jab. I think we could, I'd like to do a deep dive. I wanted to question you and hope, interrogate every single finding there. But I think if you could leave us your presentation,
absolutely,
that would be fantastic. But thank you so much, for joining us. I hope we might do this again sometime next year, maybe in the spring after we have we know a little bit more about the longer term impacts of some of the findings. We'd love to have you back, but thank you so much on behalf of UNA UK, but also UN 75. We still have lots of thank yous to come in the future, but thank you.
No, thank you. And thank this group. I mean, it's just been a lovely opportunity. I used to travel across the Atlantic. I miss that, but this has been really nice. Thank you all. And thank you all for being so interested in these issues. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you. So I think I will just jump in and answer one of the questions on what the UN is going to do with the data, and also what I hope, UNA will be able to do. So we will have disaggregated data for the UK, which really will be from the Pew Research, but also from the survey that we conducted, and from the dialogues that took place in the UK, which UNA UK was a big part of, and many of you joined in. So thank you so much for that. And then there's also some pretty fascinating media analysis. And there were a few questions that were a little bit out of the scope of this session on the media's role in really informing public views. And I think it's really striking when you look at, one of the findings, for example, was that the media tends to portray the UN, especially in this country, as a platform for countries when it comes to things like peace and security, economic issues. It's about countries gathering at the UN. Whereas on issues such as human rights, it's about the UN did this or didn't do this. So there's much more agency associated with the UN. And I think that could maybe begin to explain in some small way why people see certain areas of work in the UN as more important and more successful than others as well. So there's lots of fascinating data. And in terms of what the UN can do, I mean, I think one of the best things we can do is just give it back. So, you know, this is all based on public opinion, on media analysis. And there's just been a new data strategy that really, you know, wants to see the UN moving away from, and I don't think there's any deliberate attempt to not publish data, but it's just sort of also a little bit of cluelessness maybe on our part on how to get it out there, getting it out there in a format and anticipating what people want to do with it. So one of my final acts with the UN 75 team is creating a platform that will post as much of the data as we can in respecting privacy, etc., in downloadable format, in a way that you can manipulate, you know, the sections. You could say, you know, what do people in Birmingham age 16 and under think on X issue? And you can, you know, really kind of make it your own. I think that was the value of the My World survey that informed the Sustainable Development Goals, how it was used by organizations on the ground. And I think it will be very much the same for this data. And of course, when I come back and put on my civil society hat, we'll be thinking about really creative ways in which UNA UK can be using their data. But that should really be done, you know, by the end of this year, to share with partners such as UNA UK, and then to make publicly available in early January ahead of the Secretary General visit, hopefully in person, we're not sure, to this country at the beginning of January. So let me just conclude with saying a few things about the broader initiative that we constructed. So we're just sort of, you know, analyzing all the data from those streams, but, you know, we have a pretty good idea on what the trends are. And the key messages that I've really taken away are fairly simple, but I think they are encouraging. And I think, as I said, you know, we all need a little bit of encouragement after a difficult year, and no doubt a difficult year ahead. I mean, one of the things that we're all a little bit worried about at the UN is the extent to which there's now this sort of vaccine optimism boom, when we are well aware that, you know, the crisis is really just going to start biting in many parts of the world and many communities next year. There's a lot of fear about countries that are very fragile, that could really slip into conflict and violence. So what I take away from the survey is optimism, in the sense that the biggest message, you know, having consulted 1.5 million people directly and about 50 or so indirectly, that whatever our headlines tell us, whatever our leaders might tell us, whatever our social media feeds, you know, tell us, whatever we might feel, people across the world want more or less the same thing. We are much, much more united than we think, even in these times. And the things that we want are not beyond our wherewithal to deliver. Access to healthcare, access to education, access to technology, access to water and sanitation. These are things that the world has long said they would, you know, it would achieve. And these are things that are achievable if we prioritize them, you know, our resources in the right way. Climate change, I think it's heartening that it's remained the top issue. This should be the top issue. It's an existential issue. And I think it is, you know, it might seem motherhood and apple pie. Yes, people care about climate change, but I think it's really important that this has not been displaced, as Jeb said, over many, many years, despite the current crisis. And the final thing that gives me hope is just how important people think global cooperation is. You know, even as Jeb said, even in the, you know, our reality check survey, it really is the vast majority of people, regardless of, you know, their political affiliation, who think global cooperation is essential. And of the people who are maybe more sympathetic towards us in our survey, I looked at the figure, it's actually 98.9% who think global cooperation is essential, very important, or fairly important. And 73% actually said essential. And I think that's interesting, even if it is a sort of self-selecting group, it is a group that is, you know, highly motivated. And we need to be capitalizing on that here in the UK. And I think that the flip side of that is people want global cooperation. They believe in the UN. I think 74% of people across all our data streams said the UN was important, but they don't want the UN as it is now. They want a UN that is more effective, more open, more accountable, more inclusive. People are thinking really, really big. Some of the ideas that have come out, the solutions we were crowdsourcing, transforming the global economy, creating a new social contract, banning nuclear weapons, banning killer robots, really just remaking our societies and economies in a way that is radically different. Having a meaningful say in the decisions that affect their lives at all levels, from the UN to national to local. And I think our challenge is really, how do we step up to those expectations? That's the challenge here, because the UN can listen. It's member states who need to act. In September, member states adopted a declaration where they pledged to respond to what's coming out of our consultation. They've asked the Secretary General to set out a way forward. But you can already see, when politics sets in, when real life sets in, will there be that same ambition? And I think this is the role that UNA has been playing and can continue to play in a much bigger way, to really say this has to be our turning point. We can't aspire to return to normal when normal just wasn't working for most people in the world. So this is really our time. And I hope that we will use what comes out of this UN 75 consultation to keep up that pressure, both on the UK government and on the United Nations as well. You will hear more about some of our plans if you're joining us tomorrow for part 2 of our conference. But I'm just going to wrap up by thanking Jeb again for joining us, thanking Danny. We'll make good on our promise and reach out to his team on how we can work together more closely on some of the campaigns he mentioned. And I'll hand over to my colleague Bryony now, just to wrap up and to tell us a little bit more about tomorrow.